We're now standing on the 13th tee. Recently I ran across a picture taken in 1908 that showed the girls from Havergal College actually playing cricket on this fairway, and John Hall, our previous archivist, our original archivist, was a participant in that game. The elevator behind us was installed in 1948 at a cost of $5,200. In the early 1970s, the level of this fairway was raised a fair amount, and John, you'll supply us with some more details on that. And on the right side, there was a grove of pine trees that were put in when Bob Cowell was the Greens chairman. John, talk about the raising of the fairway and the fill that we got to do that.
The big change, the biggest change in the golf course, as you mentioned, is in the 70s when we were able to make a deal with the city to raise our golf course above the plane and get rid of a lot of the flooding. And it involved the building of the ice weirs above Dundas Street that have prevented a lot of ice damage through the years. But this fairway was raised in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 feet, largely with fill. The story goes from square one when square one was built. And that's why it's clay, it doesn't drain well, and it's hard as hell to hit off of. So those are some of the memories.
We have the new bridge that was put in on the left-hand side. I'm lost track now, but probably 10, 15 years ago, and of course there's a story on that. Jane?
The winter of 2009 was a terrible winter. Lots and lots of ice that came up from the river and gouged our fairways. I remember the 5th was one that was very badly damaged. And also in the river here, it lifted that bridge and just moved it. And Gordy Petrie, wonderful member, very generously got brought in his company, which had lots of heavy equipment, and inch by inch, meticulously, Gordy oversaw this, moved the bridge into place. It could have been destroyed, but for this very careful attention. There is a plaque on that bridge now as a tribute to Gordy Petrie.
We're now on the gold tee of the 14th hole. And this hole has certainly seen some very significant changes over the years. Back in 1986-87, the hole was relocated from its former location, which was to the right of the big willow tree that you see on the island. John?
As you pointed out, Lee, the green was to the right of that willow tree, and there was an inlet from the river that came in front of the green, and there was another little pond sort of on the halfway on the fairway on the right side. And then the blue tee for the 15th hole was directly behind that green, not very far above the river. It was maybe 2 to 3 feet above the river, but then you were hitting across the river on 15, which we will see later. The other thing was the tee was in a dramatically different position. It was back behind the current 13th green, was where the tee for 14 was. And there was an old oak tree there that you might still see the remains that it fell down about 5 years ago.
Immediately to the left, there was a proposal back in the 1980s to build 27 holes, and that property over there was going to be integrated into the project. The shareholders of the club rejected that proposal. Another proposal to build a standalone 9 holes was proposed by Gordy Bryson and several of his friends, but alas, the property over there was deemed to be too low and too expensive to develop. I'm currently standing on the gold tee of the 15th hole. The original tee was essentially in the same location, but significantly lower than where I'm standing today. On the left-hand side, just over the berm, there was another one of the 4 drinking fountains that we discussed earlier. The one on the 5th hole, there was another one between the current 8th hole and the short 8th hole, another one behind the 12th, and this one here on the left-hand side. The elevator was put in 1939 at a cost of $3,000, and there was actually an assessment of $1.60 per member for several months to help cover the cost of that. We're now standing on the 16th tee that offers the players one of the most gorgeous vistas of this golf course, looking down into the valley. The archives indicate that on the 16th hole, a bungalow for sleeping was built in 1917, but was torn down some 20 years later. Several pictures of the bungalow exist in our archives. There was a large oak tree not too far off the white tee on the right-hand side that came down a couple of years ago. But John, you have something that you want to mention just in front of where that old oak tree used to be.
Well, back before the days of Mississaugua Road being changed its location, the 16th hole and the 18th hole used to be very close together. And you were in danger on this tee from the 18th tee shots. And in order to create a better safety issue, we used to have a little bridge that went across the gullies here in front. It was just a little iron bridge, but it kept everybody a little bit safer. And of course, that big oak tree also helped a little bit.
Before we get on talking about the 17th hole, I'd be remiss not to discuss the apple trees that currently are still between the 16th green and the 17th fairway here. And in the day, the late Vic Pynchon, Gord Outret, and Dee McNally, Vic in particular, used to look after those trees. But George, you have some memories of some of the fruit that the boys used to bring to field days.
Yes, this remnants of an apple orchard. Actually, there are pear trees and plum trees mixed in. Vic patiently provided the club with those trees and came down in the spring, did the spraying, and looked after them like mother hen. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not sure which, they no longer bear fruit, and they're kept aside and not fruit bearing anymore. But it's a significant period in the life of this club.
The famous Canadian female golfer, Ada McKenzie, and her parents were members at Mississaugua. And according to the archives, for several summers they used to camp behind this 17th tee, paying the club $10 per summer. Eventually that $10 fee was waived. Looking at the video of the 1965 Canadian Open shows a series of bunkers down the right-hand side. I'm not sure when those were taken out, but they're certainly not there today. On the right was also a very, very large grove of pine trees. Unfortunately, only a few remain today, but at one point there was probably 40 or 50 pine trees that guarded that side of the fairway. I'm standing on the location of the old 18th tee, prior to the 18th tee being moved to its present location. This old 18th tee is actually to the north and the east of the 17th green. George Gathercole was instrumental in having the location of Mississaugua Road moved. And George, I'd like you to perhaps say a few words about George's involvement at Mississaugua.
I had a great personal relationship with George. He brought me on the board, and I became familiar with the impact of his influence on the activities of Mississaugua and in government relations. If it hadn't been for George Gathercole and Bob Speck of Mississaugua, we wouldn't have had that road change, which completely envelops the activities of this club.
George did a lot of things for the club, and that is why there is his portrait in the front entrance. George was head of the board when we put in the curling rink, and that made our club a year-round club. He also, I understand, was responsible for a bill in the House of Commons in Britain, which lifted the embargo on the mining of granite from Ailsa Craig, which was a Scottish isle, so that we had that granite for our curling rocks. George was also head of the board here when we got our first coat of arms with the motto, "Always friends and boon companions." And near and dear, he was the head when we got our first liquor license, and my understanding is we were the first private golf club in Ontario to get a liquor license.
Again, we're standing at the former 18th tee, and as previously indicated, Mississaugua Road used to run right down our present 18th fairway. John, could you perhaps expand on where Mississaugua Road was and where this 18th fairway was at the time?
We're glad to, Lee. As we look down here, we can see all of these maple trees here. Well, of course, they weren't there. As you're playing, when you go out and play 17, and 18, and 1, if you look to your left, when you go down, when you're playing those, you'll see a line of maples. And those maples were the borderline just inside club property from Mississaugua Road. And it clearly defines where Mississaugua Road was. Definitely inside the mounds from the practice field. So that gives you a picture of what the course was at that time. And 18 and 1 were very challenging, tight holes to play.
One thing I'd like to recall was the former 18th green, which was certainly much lower than it is today, and I believe a little farther forward and a little farther right as well. And of course, in the old days, and that was changed for the 1974 Canadian Open, but the old green used to just run right back into an area where there was a lot of just flat green and Muskoka chairs where people used to sit out and have their beverages after a round of golf.
I can remember clearly the nest of about 30 or 40 white Muskoka chairs that were there. And of course, back in those days as well, there was a patio out. If you look at the point of land, as you look from 18 green towards 15th hole, you'll see a point of land. And there used to be a patio out there with the flagpole. And you used to be able to press a little button on a post and call the steward to come out with a drink. Good old days.
We have a lot of wildlife around this course, which is one thing I love, particularly the deer and the hawks overhead. We also used to have a lot of red fox, and I don't see them anymore. Perhaps the coyotes got them, and they used to follow us. And sometimes they would pick up our ball and run away. In fact, one once picked my ball out of the bunker and dropped it. And I've kind of liked the critters ever since.
We're on the front lawn of the clubhouse at the present time, where the old practice putting green used to be, John.
Yeah, that's right.
What else do you remember about this area?
Well, I remember there used to be, in the olden days, an old concrete pond with a fountain in it, in which you could have a seat in one of the two benches that used to be placed there and contemplate the world going by. To your right, people were teeing off on the first hole, and to your left, people were putting on the old putting green, which is pretty much defined as the shortest grass that's cut here. Not quite as large, perhaps half the size that it is now, but it was, as you can see, when you're around walking this area, quite a lot of different contours is what we experience on the golf course today.
I hope you've enjoyed this trip down memory lane today, discussing the many changes that have occurred to our beautiful clubhouse and our beautiful golf course. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Jane Watson, George Blumenauer, and John Cornwall for their comments today, their insights into what is a terrific, terrific place to be. Thank you.